Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back from another episode of the Libertarian Censored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Censored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have life expectancy versus healthcare spending, posted by Fear the Creeper, and that looks like a chart of life expectancy versus healthcare expenditure from 1970 to 2018, and you can see all the countries are pretty much in the same have the same trajectory when it comes to life expectancy and health expenditure per capita. But you see Israel, Spain, Italy, South Korea, Australia, Japan, etc., etc. They're pretty much on the same trajectory. But then you see the USA, and it's got a much more healthcare expenditure per capita, and yet lower life expectancy. All these other countries. I think that would be because the government is the U.S. right now. You have pretty much the worst of private healthcare and the worst of public healthcare put together with the Affordable Care Act. And I personally think I think the libertarian position in regards to healthcare, if you want the government to pay for it through voluntary taxation, you want to earmark your money specifically to pay for healthcare through the government, I think you should be able to. But I do think the private sector needs to be an option as well. I think the U.S. should stop, pussyfooting around and just let people decide whether they want private funded healthcare or public funded healthcare, rather than force everyone to use their combined system that no one really likes. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have blaming boomers for everything is dumb when large swaths of the voting public from previous and younger generations support many of the policies that reduce our freedom and increase our cost of living. And that was a self-post from Historical Donut 6758, and they said, it's getting played out. The political system, politicians, bureaucrats, and the voting public is the problem, and blaming any generation and not the political system itself ensures that the next generation of older people will be to blame, and the actual problem, the political system itself, will be ignored. And I'd agree with that. A lot of politics these days is boomer hatred, and I personally don't really care for the boomers, but their generation's more par for the course than anything particularly special. Ultimately the system itself is to blame. I would agree with that, and I think the libertarian position is you gotta get rid of or fix the system entirely, rather than just blame whatever the current wealthiest generation is. And that's my thoughts on that issue. And then next we have White House launches tracker to call out media offenders, aka anyone disagreeing with Trump, but from DW.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that. I think a lot of the media does misrepresent a lot of Trump's policies and quotes, but ultimately, I think, it should be up to individual people to hold them to account for that, rather than having an official government-run tracker for it. I think, if people want to call them out, they should be able to, but I don't know if it should be an official government-run tracker. I think Trump, he likes to call them out a lot. If he wants to do that, I think that's fine, but I don't think there should be an official government-run tracker to do that. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Trump frees fraudster, just stays into 7-year prison sentence. David Gentile has been found guilty for his role in what prosecutors described as a $1.6 billion scheme that defrauded thousands of investors, from nytimes.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't think, it just goes to show you that, the elites, when they do drug dealing, they'll always find a way out of it. But when the, or not drug dealing in this case, they're defrauding, but, they'll always find a way out of it. But, if I were to do that, but if non-elite were to do that, I'd have to serve the entire 7-year prison sentence. And, it just goes to show you that, I think Trump pardoned the former president of Honduras for drug trafficking recently, but he constantly bombs boats in Venezuela because they're drug traffickers, and she'll show you that when the elites do it, they'll always find a way out of it, but when the peasants do it, they're going to face the full extent of the law, and that's very much what the government is. They're always going to treat some classes better than others. A lot you have the Democrats mainly pushing anarcho-tyranny right now in the cities, where the it's kind of the opposite. The low status crime doers can do whatever they want, but if you jaywalk once, they'll send you to prison for the rest of your life. And it just goes to show you that the government's going to be inherently biased towards the in-group, or who considers the in-group rather than the out-group. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Time Will Tell, posted by Ragnarok XG, and that's a cross post from the Blue Sky Skeet subreddit, which looks like it's since been removed, so I don't really have anything to say on that, because, it's been removed, so I can't really say anything on that, I would say, if I can't really see it. Next, we have Trump vows to step up unprecedented assault on immigrants. President Donald Trump has doubled down on his push to revoke some American citizenship from the DailyBeast.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, I personally don't really care for that. But, ultimately, if the government has the ability to justify doing whatever it wants to, regardless of your immigration status, and if the government wants to go after anyone it considers to be an illegal immigrant, even if they do have citizenship, ultimately they have the monopoly and legal force to do so, even if, it's completely unjust, and that's very much why you can't trust the government to ultimately enforce the law, because they can justify enforcing it however they feel like, and oftentimes there's nothing you can do about it since they control the court and legal system as well. Then we have What Sterner Would Make If He Was Alive, posted by Anarcho Federation. That's a cross-post from the Full Egoism subreddit, and that looks like a quote from Max Stirner over the Turning Point, over meme that says Turning Point Egoism. It says, "Dear objectivists, Randians, and rational egoists, you say you believe exclusively objective reality, yet base your philosophy in rational self-interest, which is subjective, curious." And yeah, personally, I would say that the libertarian position is, if you want to believe in objective reality or subjective reality, believe in whatever reality you want to, as long as you're not forcing those beliefs on others. And yeah, personally, I do think people are always going to act in their own self-interest, and that's something that, why we should probably have as small a government as possible, because those in government positions are always going to act in their own self-interest of what they see as beneficial for themselves and their agendas and causes, and that's very much why we shouldn't elevate the government too much and give it so much power, if people are always going to act in their own self-interest when it comes to supporting their agendas and causes, as I said. Next, we have Natural Monopolies, posted by Fear the Creeper, and they said, electric lighting companies, gas companies, and telephone companies are often claimed to be a natural monopoly, which makes me wonder why they spend so much money lobbying for laws that make competing with them illegal. 6 electric light companies were organized in 1 year in 1887 in New York City. 45 electric light companies had the legal right to operate in Chicago in 1907. Prior to 1895, Duluth, Minnesota was served by 5 electric light companies, and Scranton, Pennsylvania had 4 in 1906. During the later part of the 19th century, competition was the usual situation in the gas industry in this country. Before 1884, 6 competing companies were operating in New York City. Competition was common, especially persistent in the telephone industry. Baltimore, Chicago, Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, Kansas City, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and St. Louis, among the larger cities, had at least 2 telephone services in 1905. One begins to doubt that scale economies characterized the utility industry at the time when regulation replaced market competition. Source Harold Demsetz, ed. Efficiency, Competition, and Policy, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Blackwell, 1989, page 78. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, a lot of monopolies are government made for regulation. Before the government started regulating, as this guy noted, we had you had numerous electric lighting companies and numerous telephone companies, but then the government started regulating them, and suddenly there was only one. And it just goes to show you that pretty much every monopoly, I would say, is the result of government interference. If people aren't forced to use something by the government, maybe we'd have a more diverse market. That might not be true in all instances. Google's probably always going to be the dominant search engine, as long as, even if it's not government enforced. But regardless, I definitely do think the libertarian position is, we shouldn't have any regulations that benefit bigger companies over smaller companies. Everyone should be able to enter whatever business they feel like, rather than have the state picking winners and losers. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump's pardon of Honduras' ex-president shows counter-drug effort is based on lies and hypocrisy from TheGuardian.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, as I said earlier, I agree with that. Ultimately, the state, when the wealthy elites do something to drug trafficking, Trump will be completely fine with it. But when the poors do it, like they are in Venezuela, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for either of them. But it ultimately goes to show you that the government's gonna reward those in positions that with social and economic capital, while punishing those with the lack of social and economic capital. And increasingly, I would say the Democrats, they're trying to do kind of the opposite. They're trying to reward those who have lack of economic and social capital. Like the one guy who stabbed that Ukrainian refugee on the train in Charlotte, he had 14 prior arrests, but he was still roaming the streets. Ultimately, it just goes to show you that, as I said earlier, the state is always going to reward those who it sees in the in group while punishing those who it sees in the out to be in the out group, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have The Pyramid of Power, Chapter 1, Big Education, posted by Hot Organization 157, and that's a cross-post from the Ideology of Justice subreddit, and that's the YouTube video from BeFreeX. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Big Anything, I would say. The big Big Anything is that's going to be overly concentrated in controlled by the elites, like big media, big business, big government. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian perspective is you gotta decentralize from the bigs. You gotta decentralize from big education, big government, big business, so you don't have one group pretty much ruling over you like we have currently. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Why Privacy Matters, Why It's Dead, and What It Entails, posted by Hot Organization 157. That's cross-post from the Ideology of Justice subreddit, and that's the YouTube video from Unsolicited Advice. And yeah, personally, I do think privacy is important, but ultimately you have to operate under the assumption that there is no privacy anymore, because the government's probably always watching you, probably tons of private companies and maybe even foreign governments watching you as well, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's just how it is sometimes. When, people can justify, the NSA spying revelations were over a decade ago now. They were back in 2013, that the NSA was spying on American citizens. It's probably only gotten worse since then. Next, we have Costco sues the Trump administration seeking a refund of tariffs from NBCNews.com, hosted by CH4Locks, and that's crosspost from the economics subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, if anyone wants to sue anyone for any reason, they should be able to. But regardless, I think, some companies shouldn't be given preferential company in regards to tariff over other companies. Costco's a big company. If it wins this lawsuit, it might be given preferential treatment over smaller companies in regards to tariff refunds. But, of course, Reddit, they'd support that because, Reddit only cares when, Orange Man loses, and if Costco wins, that means Orange Man has to lose. So that means, Reddit really only sees, politics through the lens of Orange Man bad, nothing else. Next, we have a nationwide internet age verification plan is sweeping Congress, and in parentheses, internet usage tracking requirement for all Americans, posted from TheVerge.com, posted by CH4Locks. And yeah, personally, as I said earlier, the government's already probably spying on us and tracking all our data. I even without this new age verification plan, it's probably only get worse as time goes on, just like with a lot of other issues. And that's my thoughts on that issue. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.